Hello and welcome to the Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun. Today I have a very special guest with us, Helen Berents. Hi Helen, how are you?
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's really great that you could join us today. I'd just like to take a moment and notice that we are having this episode during Reconciliation Week in Australia. Reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. And the theme this year is In It Together. I'm reminded of the quote attributed to Lilla Watson and the Aboriginal activist group she was part of in the 1970s. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. I'd just like to start with an acknowledgement that we are meeting on unceded land and that sovereignty was never ceded. I'm coming from the traditional land of the people of the Kulin Nation, and Helen is coming from the land of the Turrbal Yagara people and Yagara people. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Helen, it's great that you're here to chat about kids and young people in conflict and peace. I would love to know more about your research, but also how you got interested in this and your pathway to where you are now.
Sure. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm always very excited to talk about, as you say, kids and youth and conflict and peace. I don't want to start with, when I was a child, but when I was a child, I had the, back in the day when I was born, I had the, enormous privilege of living overseas when I was young with my family. I spent some time in Latin America when I was a kid, and I know it sounds really naff to say, but it was the first time I kind of thought about and being confronted by poverty and inequality and a kind of a world that was very different to what I had been used to and what I had grown up with. And so I think that I kind of am grateful in hindsight for my parents for taking us there and for traveling around to really kind of understand how people live differently and recognize that my experience is not the experience of many people kind of in the world. And then kind of jumping forward, thinking about it kind of in an academic context, I did my studies in anthropology and in peace and conflict studies, which was a major that was offered kind of in the international relations program at the University of Queensland. And those kind of things made me think about the people. Anthropology obviously is kind of study of people and cultures and society. And at the same time, I was studying these subjects where people were incredibly absent. We were talking about institutions and power and the relations of states and things. And I discovered feminism. I'm just full of naff, one-liners today.
Yeah. Was that your invention? That's incredible.
I discovered it out there. All these brilliant people who had been thinking about these questions of equality and power and who gets represented and who gets a voice. And one of my favorite of the kind of feminists working in that space is Cynthia Enloe, and she just asks the very simple question, where are the women? So when we're talking about international politics, where are they in both their absence and then also where their invisible presence props up systems and supports the functions of power? And that question made me ask where the other people were who were missing too, right? So who else is missing, who is marginalized, whose voices are excluded? And feminist work kind of positions very nicely to kind of ask those kind of questions, right? Who else is missing? And then where are they, right? And if they're not in the halls of power, then their lives are happening in everyday places, which are incredibly complex, just as much as Parliament or the UN or whatever kind of institutions we were being forced to study we were being asked to study as students. So I guess those kind of things kind of came together, this interest in an awareness that the world is not always a lovely place for people, that they do find challenges, inequality, difficult accessing power, services, structures, and then that kind of power and access is distributed unevenly, and that there are groups that are often left out. So that's, I guess, kind of where I came to asking these questions, right? Where are young people in this? And I mean, it seems like a really obvious question, but often we don't think about it, right? There's 1.8 billion young people in the world, and almost 30% of the world is under the age of 18. And then I'm very much not a stats person, but stats help sometimes paint a quick picture.
Contextualize what's going on.
It. So we're talking a big number of people. 1 in 4 of them are affected by violence or armed conflict in some way. I said that almost 30% are under the age of 18, but if we're talking about like refugee or internally displaced populations, that number's about half. And then there's parts of the world that are particularly young. Right? So 60% of the continent of Africa is under 25. So it's an incredibly young population. And then yet Africa is kind of characterized by the type of rule it's one of my favorite words, which is gerontocracy. So rule by old people, right? And there's a study that says, I'm trying to remember the numbers, like in Europe and North America, the average age difference between citizens and leaders is, I think, about 15, 18 years, something like that. And in Africa, it's 44 years or something difference from the average age of the population and the average age of leaders of the countries. So they're there and they're not represented, right, when we talk about the kinds of problems and issues that the world, that we all have to confront in the world. And so I guess that's by way of where I get to now.
So just to kind of draw from what you said, you're interested in asking who is not in the room, who is in the room, and when you ask who's not represented, young people kind of become very obviously not present in the processes that determine the future of the reality that they then will live in. Yeah. And it also sounds like you're tackling with fairly big topics of like those questions, whether it's like crises, violence, war. How are young people politicized and used in those contexts today?
Sure. So I think it's, if we're talking about, I guess, how they're politicized and how they're seen, I think that's a really important question. As you say, it's not only that they're not there, but their absence often isn't noticed, right? Like in a room of people making decisions, people don't look around and go, where are the young people here, right? And I think that women's rights advocates have done a lot of work in making women's absence visible in those spaces, and that we've seen the benefits of that, right? We include women in peace processes. Peace is likely to last longer, all those kinds of effects. But we don't ask that same question about kids or even young people, right? Whether we're talking under or over 18. So like that's one question, right? Young people themselves not being there, not being positively engaged. But children and young people are absolutely invoked and talked about and used when we talk about conflict and when we talk about violence and things that goes on. We often see young people described as kind of a problem, a risk, a threat. That young people, if they're not dealt with, they will contribute to the violence in that kind of way. A recent report that was commissioned by the UN described them as kind of a problem to be solved, right? Like they're not actors in their own right. They kind of exist there as a problem and a risk, a danger, a spoiler to potential peace processes, that kind of thing. So we get this very negative kind of connotation of young people. And that connotation is very gendered as well, right? We're talking largely about young men, right? When we kind of use that shorthand. And then the other kind of way in which young people are invoked and talked about are as victims or at risk and things. So we see them as women and children, right? As a vulnerable category, which they absolutely are. Like, don't get like when I'm saying this,
right.
Don't get me wrong. Like, right, they absolutely are, but they get essentialized down to that. And again, that's very gendered, right? It's feminized in particular ways. And children get talked about in this way that they're kind of universalized, right? Like particularly young children, they're seen as pre-political, or this kind of, we can all imagine being that child or having that child or knowing that kind of child. And so they're a very powerful kind of symbol that gets evoked and used. And we can see that in very obvious and famous ways, like, for example, the death of Alan Kurdi in 2015, the toddler that was trying to cross the Mediterranean and died on the Turkish beach. And the kind of universal kind of outpouring of grief and recognition, right? Because this child was a child, it could be any kind of child, right? So then we can kind of care about it, that are absolutely then operationalized and used by politicians in particular ways for their kind of own purpose and ends too. So
yeah, right. Like the power of the image to turn a person into a symbol. And I guess in both cases that you just mentioned, one where young people are not present in the room and just unable to speak their voice, and then when they are evoked or represented, they are done so either to like weaponize or represent as a problem or as a symbol of victimhood or hope. In both of these cases, agency is removed. It sounds like the child doesn't have any personhood themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And not only that, I think absolutely the child, but also often the space that's been talked about, right? So we talk about these kind of images most recently, right, coming out of Syria or in previous conflicts, these kind of places, the suffering of the child is seen, like the adults they're not in the room, the adults kind of around them can't take care of the child, right? So then you end up in this place where we can see children being used to necessitate kind of military intervention into countries. You know, it was part of, we talked a lot about vulnerable women going into Afghanistan, right, decade or whatever ago, but children are absolutely part of that narrative as well. And we see it in Syria, for example. Recently, I say recently, it's now a few years old, when there was a gas attack on a town in Syria, and there was a lot of images that circulated on social media. This is the fun one.
I remember.
About dead children and children like kind of choking from the gas attack and things. And President Trump had just become president of the US, and he described them as beautiful babies, which is an interesting description of these dead children images, and then kind of used that as a justification to launch airstrikes, not on the town, like somewhere else in Syria, because of, you know, the barbarity of the act required that kind of intervention. So we see how they kind of get politicized and used. And obviously there are really important debates to have about what should be the appropriate response to a government or a regime that uses chemical weapons against its population, you know, but like the politics of childhood that's going on in there, right, as the justification and the reason to kind of do it, I think is really important, because we don't notice it, it just kind of happens. And I really like it's a moment that I think we need to be more kind of reflective of and conscious kind of like what is the politics of childhood that's going on, like in those kind of moments.
It sounds like about as uninterrogated as the notion that children shouldn't be in politics because they're too young, or, you know, that kind of thing. And so I do want to ask more about images of the dead and of suffering, and the effect of that has on kind of like the global temperature in our understanding of what's happening worldwide. Do you have any insight from your research into that kind of thinking?
I mean, I think we often understand disaster through these kinds of images, but I think it's also really important to think about when we do and don't see images of, I mean, not just children, but dead people in general, and in what kinds of contexts or states we see them, right? When are we allowed to see someone just dead on the street, shot in a civil war, and when do we see their you know, Facebook profile picture or something instead, right? Like, and that absolutely is subject to uneven global power and things, right? The kinds of bodies we're able to see. There was an outcry last year when the New York Times published images of the attacks on the hotels in Kenya that included some images of bodies kind of in it. And quite rightly, a lot of African scholars and commentators were like, you wouldn't show white bodies like this, right? So like thinking about the racial kind of dynamics of those kinds of images and how they help us understand conflict, or how we come to kind of read images of conflict. Having said that, I think like obviously conflicts are not the only place we kind of think about death and see images of death. And I mean, the elephant in the room right now, right, is COVID and thinking about the incredible volume of death that's going on, but that is so invisible there's no spectacular violence and images of social media. Well, there absolutely is images on social media of it, but not in the same way. Like they're not circulating like after a terrorist attack or something like that. And I think how we think about death and how we kind of engage in seeing and thinking about a kind of collective response to that is really interesting in the current context as well.
Yeah, that strikes me like we haven't had a defining image of the COVID outbreak. You know, when I think of other conflicts, particularly ones that are exoticized and overseas, I can often recall like, oh yeah, this was the photo that kind of hit the zeitgeist or captured the thing. But with COVID-19, despite being a global phenomenon with like, as you mentioned, the volume of dead is vast, and yet we're not seeing any particular image. It's kind of just this small outpouring, and you've written about this as well. What do you think that means, or why is that the case?
I mean, I think it's always hard to talk about death for someone that pays a lot of attention to death. I'm also very bad at thinking about like my own mortality, and, you know, like it's very easy as a human, right? You compartmentalize it and you don't kind of think about those kind of things. And that can be a survival kind of mechanism, right? Particularly in something like this that's ongoing and uncertain. And I mean, in Australia, we're much luckier than other parts of the world, right? But there's this kind of, when will it end? What will it be? How will I be affected? It's quite easy not to think about it. In order to live your life, right? In order to survive day to day kind of thing. I mean, that's not just true of COVID, right? That's like in war zones and things too, right? Like how do you maintain routine and daily life and things? I'm not necessarily comparing COVID to war zones, but in terms of that kind of the uncertainty of an environment beyond your control.
Yeah, right. As a side note, I'm interested in the way that COVID and war zones are often compared, right? Like frontline workers and things like that. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, go on.
No, actually, it's a really nice segue because I think it talks nicely to the other reason why I don't think we're talking about and seeing images of death, and that's because there are politics at play, right? In terms of we don't want to show it because then we're not in control of it, and you know, how do we narrativize like collectively like what is going on, and in whose interest is it that we don't kind of collectively kind of stop and be happy to stay in our houses, that kind of drive back to economic recovery, which is absolutely important and vital, right? Unemployment and people losing their jobs and that. But the kind of collective societal care for each other, right? That is what staying in our homes means at the moment in terms of getting on top of this crisis, like here and overseas and things as well. So I think just like, I mean, like the war metaphor you mentioned, right? Frontline, we start using that kind of language. Well, like frontline soldiers are the like cannon fodder. They're the ones that were willing to die in order to get to our objective. So using that kind of language definitely, again, we're subconsciously, right, trained to kind of not really think about the implications when we hear that word, but think towards their implications and the acceptance of that kind of thing. Like, what is an acceptable death rate for COVID in terms of us being able to go have brunch? You know, like those kind of questions. And I think America is absolutely struggling with that in particular at the moment. Right, the opening up, whilst the curve is still going up, raises questions about what is valued, right, in that kind of context, and how society kind of thinks of itself as a thing collectively together.
So we've mentioned, I guess, now the focus on who's not in the room, on kids and young people in different types of crises, whether that's war, violence, pandemics. Sorry, let me rephrase this. I guess I want to ask about the flip side of it. Like, okay, so we've talked about the ways in which kids don't have agency. In what ways do kids actually have agency, and how are they leading the way towards a brighter future? To be all inspirational.
As I say, the scale balancing of my incredible, like, depressing trench about talking about dead people. Let me talk about the good stuff.
Yeah, we'll come out of it together. It'll be good.
I think that, I mean, if we're not including young people, I mean, there's other categories of people, my particular interest in young people. If we're not including young people, then we're not getting a full picture of either the effects of conflict or efforts to respond to it, right? And if we're not getting that full picture, then we can't work to support it and build it, right? So if we're talking about sustainable peace and inclusive peace and these kinds of buzzwords that go on in the peace building space, then what does inclusive mean if we're not including young people, right? I mean, there's a whole lot of complicated things about what inclusion is, but, you know, like as a kind of foundational kind of idea. And I think the thing is that what's really important to realize is, despite the fact that we're terrible at recognizing young people and young people's agency and young people's activism and advocacy and the work that they do, they're doing it anyway. It goes on all over the world at all kinds of levels, right? So we notice it sometimes. Greta Thunberg, you know, I mean, kind of recently, and obviously the hundreds of thousands, millions of young people that have kind of joined the Fridays for Future school strike kind of movement, which is absolutely amazing. And we're very good at kind of seeing it when we think it's exceptional. Malala Yousafzai is an example too, right? This kind of young girl that exceeded expectations of what a girl should do and be like in that context. But young people do things kind of all the time in their local communities, right? I think that my interest is obviously in kind of war-affected context, but we've seen it go on here with young people organising like food drives for elderly community members who can't leave their houses and things, right? Like they just kind of get on and do those kind of things sometimes. And I think what's interesting is in recent years, there's been more of a recognition of that kind of work. So that's not just been magical, like happened out of nowhere. That also has been due in large part due to young people's advocacy themselves to kind of get their work recognised in particular places. But in 2015, we saw the UN Security Council, the highest body of the highest organ of the United Nations, for the first time recognise young people's kind of positive potential contribution to international peace and security, right? Which is the thing that the Security Council is concerned with. The Security Council absolutely mentioned young people before, but it very much was in those kind of ways we were talking about before, as a problem, as a potential spoiler, you know, let's look out, you know, worry about the young people. So in 2015, they passed this resolution, Resolution 2250 for the nerds out there, on youth, peace and security. And this really kind of, I think, has kind of catalysed international attention. So a UN Security Council resolution now means that there's kind of weight behind it in some way. You know, we can debate the merits of how weighty any decisions the Security Council is these days, but
oh, the shade.
It's kind of you tell you're talking to an international relations scholar when it gets shady about the UN.
Spill the tea, you know, like.
No, the young people are much more interesting than boring diplomats. What was I going to say? Sorry. I got distracted.
Sorry. So you're saying that the UN Security Council, for the first time, kind of acknowledged.
Yeah. And it really gave, I think, capacity to other kinds of parts of the UN as well as other bodies to do things like provide funding and support, and also just a mandate to include young people, right? So that actually we should include young people and we should consider their interests and what they're doing where possible when we're trying to solve, you know, problems of violence and conflict and things like that. It also has given young people themselves a real kind of a foot in the door, as actually one interviewee told me last year. So I'm doing some work particularly around youth-led peace building and peace builders, so young people that run organisations by and for young people themselves. And a lot of them are saying it gives them some legitimacy, so they can go to, whether it's their local council, whether it's their like federal government, whether it's some regional organisation, and say, the UN said you have to include us, right? And we have these ideas and we've been doing this kind of stuff with mixed results, the report so far. But that makes a difference, right? So there was this survey that was done a year or so after the resolution that was passed, but it was done about kind of, you know, pre-resolution of, I think, about 400 youth-led peacebuilding organisations from around the world. And it found that a majority of them operate on less than $5,000 a year. The majority of them are volunteer run. They're not paid positions that young people occupy, that these young people are working pre-conflict, so they're working to try and prevent conflict in various ways, or violence even. They're working to limit the impacts of conflict while it's ongoing. They're working in post-conflict contexts. They're working in kind of spaces of justice, so truth and reconciliation, transitional justice kind of spaces. And that they were doing it before the UN kind of paid attention to them. But that also means they're very well placed now. There's attention to kind of, you know, really take and run with anything they kind of get. So it's really, I mean, it's really interesting that kind of alongside the climate justice kind of movement and the centrality of young people there, I think it's a really interesting time to kind of be paying attention to where and how young people are kind of engaging in these spaces that traditionally have excluded them.
And is this something that's quite new in the long arc of history? Like, is this the first time that young people have been included in this way? And is that our future going forward? And if so, like, what are the conditions that both led to it, and what can we do to improve it continuously?
I mean, I think it's probably the first time we've seen this kind of happen. I mean, if we exclude the, you know, kind of kings that got put on thrones when they were
13
Europe kind of, you know, kind of context. Do you think that there, you know, is kind of something novel about this moment? I don't think it's come from nowhere. I absolutely think things like the success of the inclusion of women in peace and security kind of processes has kind of opened a lot of doors to this idea that we should include more groups and more diverse groups. Indigenous justice and Indigenous rights campaigns have done that similarly, you know, for other groups that have been traditionally marginalized. So I think that there absolutely is this kind of move to thinking about what peace looks like, not just as an absence of war, or not just as peace that's made in kind of grand halls or whatever, but what does peace look like when it actually is built from the community, it's built with the people who are impacted by it. And that's been going on for a long time, obviously, right? That kind of community level, local level kind of response to violence, community building, but to be recognised in a way where perhaps some kind of meaningful resources can be put behind it, I think is kind of an opportunity and an important thing to kind of pay attention to. In terms of what we can do to support it, I mean, listen to young people, right? take them seriously, like recognise them and what they've done as meaningful and as legitimate, right? Thinking about the fact that they are young doesn't mean that their experience is invalid, that they have things to kind of say and unique perspectives. I think that the school strike for climate, kind of Fridays for Future, that those kind of movements that are talking about, like, it's their, you know, like it's literally their future, right? So you have a say in the present. It's kind of a really nice kind of concise articulation of what's at stake kind of there, right? It's not just young people are the future, which is that nice kind of, you know, naff saying.
Goes on a t-shirt.
But young people are the present, right? Because there needs to be a future for them, I guess, in the words of the climate strikers and things. Last year, I was talking to a network of youth-led organisations. The headquarters is in The Hague, and sitting in their conference room, I could see like the spires of the Peace Palace, the Palace of Justice. That was kind of you know, houses the International Court of Justice and all of that. That was, you know, founded, whatever, I'm going to get the year wrong, 100 years or whatever ago, by a lot of very serious men, you know, Andrew Carnegie and, you know, a whole lot of European leaders and things to, you know, create the laws of war, you know, the Red Cross kind of stuff, and, you know, provide some kind of order, right? Bring not peace, but some kind of justice. And I was thinking about the kinds of peace that these young people are describing, like community-led initiatives, young men who left armed groups in Kenya, helping young men leaving armed groups to find livelihood, employment, campaigning for youth inclusion in transitional justice processes in Liberia, like whatever this might be, right? And trying to reconcile that with the idea of kind of peace and justice that these men, you know, 100 years ago were talking about. And I think we kind of see how far we're coming in thinking about what peace is, right? And what peace could look like as kind of a a collective, socially constituted thing that is supported and inclusive in meaningful ways.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the powerful and beautifully spoken reminder of why we need to take young people seriously and how they should be involved in the processes of activism and peace building worldwide. Let's strive towards that future together.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to beat my drum.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks, Helen. Take care.
Thank you.
You're watching The Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun. We have new episodes daily where we get to talk to just the most incredible people. You can check out episodes on our website, distillery.site, and also follow us on the socials, Instagram @distillery.site and Twitter @distillery site. Check back again tomorrow for a new episode. Take care, everyone.